Number 1. Antonio Reyes. By the time Chicago police publicly laid out the case in February 2025, the most unsettling part was not just the body count, it was the timeline. Prosecutors said Antonio Reyes was only 16 and 17 years old when he was allegedly linked to 6 killings and 4 additional shootings across Chicago's southwest side in 2020. Imagine learning that the person accused of carrying out attacks months apart in different neighborhoods was not some older career criminal everyone had been watching, but a teenager who, for years, sat at the center of separate cases before investigators said the pattern finally came into focus. Before the case exploded into headlines, Reyes was not publicly known as the face of a sprawling series of attacks. According to police and prosecutors, he was a young Chicago man moving through the Gage Park, Brighton Park, and West Lawn areas, later described in court as a gang member, known by the street nickname Red Rum. What makes cases like this so unnerving is how ordinary the setting feels. These were not hidden places. These were blocks with gas stations, parked cars, family errands, church traffic, and people waiting to pick someone up. The accusations that followed would paint a picture of violence that, investigators say, touched both strangers and people who may have known him. Police say the first attack tied to Reyes happened on March 2, 2020, when 31-year-old Francisco Mangana was killed on West 59th Street. Just over a month later, on April 5th, 21-year-old Claudio Cosio was killed while waiting in his car on South Sacramento Avenue, and another man survived that same shooting. Then, on May 1st, 16-year-old Damian Duran was found killed in an alley on South Homan Avenue. If you imagine living in those neighborhoods at the time, the fear starts to make more sense. These were not events packed into one chaotic night. They were spaced out, long enough for each case to feel isolated, long enough maybe for no one outside the investigation to realize they might be connected. Then came June 24, 2020. Prosecutors say Reyes killed 26-year-old Luis Davalos Garcia while Garcia was sitting in a car on South Rockwell Avenue. That case became the turning point, at least publicly, because Reyes was arrested in December 2020 in connection with that killing and remained in custody afterward. But the story, investigators say, did not end there. By the time authorities announced the broader case in 2025, they alleged that the June arrest had only captured one piece of something much larger. That is what gives the case its slow burn quality. The sense that one arrest had happened years earlier, while 5 other homicide cases were still waiting to be stitched together. The final 2 killings in the charge series came in November 2020, just one day apart. Prosecutors say 31-year-old Jose Martinez was attacked while with his 3 young children, as the family was out to buy a puppy, and that Martinez later died from his injuries. The next day, 20-year-old Justin Gonzalez was killed while waiting in a car to pick up his girlfriend. Police say Reyes also faces attempted murder counts tied to those episodes, including the 3 children who were in Martinez's car. That is where the case becomes especially chilling from a storytelling standpoint. Not just the number of alleged victims, but the randomness prosecutors described. One person buying a drink, another waiting for basketball, another sitting in a car, another out with his children. Ordinary moments interrupted without warning. So, how did investigators say they connected all of this? According to Chicago police and Cook County prosecutors, detectives spent years building the larger case using ballistics, surveillance footage, tips, social media material, and statements Reyes allegedly made to other people. Authorities said a .40 caliber handgun recovered after the June 2020 killing helped link multiple attacks. They also said Reyes made social media posts that became part of the evidentiary trail. But this is where the case gets more complicated. Not every victim's family agreed with the early public theory that Reyes had no connection to any of the victims. Damian Duran's mother told the Sun-Times that her son had known Reyes, had spent time with him, and that she had even exchanged messages connected to him after her son disappeared. In other words, even as police presented a broad pattern, some of the human details were still messy, emotional, and deeply contested. The legal process moved in layers rather than one dramatic courtroom finish. Reyes, already jailed in the Davalos Garcia case, was charged in February 2025 with 5 additional killings from the same 2020 span, bringing the public total to 6 homicide charges along with 4 attempted murder charges. At later hearings, prosecutors added more disturbing allegations, including claims that Reyes made admissions to witnesses and behaved in ways they said showed contempt for the victims. His defense pushed back hard, arguing the state's case relied on weak witnesses, including convicted criminals and a jailhouse informant, and that some cooperating witnesses had strong reasons to say what prosecutors wanted to hear. In a case like this, that matters, because until a trial happens, the courtroom battle is not about headlines. It is about whether the state can prove, one charge at a time, that the story investigators assembled will hold under cross-examination. As of the latest widely reported hearings in 2025, Reyes had been ordered held in custody in the multiple murder cases, with further court proceedings still ahead. There has been no final verdict in the full 6-victim case, and no sentencing because the prosecution is still pending. So, the ending for now is not a sentence. It is a question hanging over Chicago's southwest side. How many of these attacks can prosecutors ultimately prove, and how did someone so young become the center of allegations this vast? That may be the part that lingers most. Not only the accusations themselves, but the idea that for years, several grieving families were living in separate stories, only to be told that the same name might sit at the center of all of them. Number 2. Nicholas Troy Sheely. For 6 days in late June 2008, the Midwest was gripped by the kind of story that feels impossible while it is still unfolding. A missing man in one Illinois town, then more bodies in another, then a family in Rock Falls, then a couple found behind a gas station in Missouri, and at the center of it all was Nicholas Troy Sheely, a 28-year-old ex-con from the Sterling and Rock Falls area, whose name suddenly turned into the focus of a 2-state manhunt. Imagine waking up each morning to find out the map had widened again, and the victim count had climbed with it. Before the spree, Sheely was already well known to police in his hometown. Associated Press reporting in July 2008 said his record stretched from marijuana possession to domestic battery, resisting officers, aggravated battery, robbery, drug charges, and weapons offenses. Illinois corrections records cited at the time said he had previously served nearly 3 years in prison for aggravated robbery. People who knew him described someone with a temper and escalating trouble, but even they said the scale of what happened next seemed beyond anything they expected. That detail matters because cases like this rarely begin with a headline. They begin with a person other people think they already understand. Investigators said the chain of killings began on June 23, 2008, with 93-year-old Russell Reed in Sterling, Illinois. Reed's body was later found in the trunk of a car. Prosecutors would go on to argue that Sheely was desperate for money and drugs, and that Reed became the first victim in a spree that would move fast and feel almost chaotic in real time. 5 days later, on June 28th, 65-year-old Ronald Randall was killed in Galesburg. Prosecutors said Randall was targeted because Sheely needed transportation and did not want to be reported. Randall's pickup truck was taken, and that truck became one of the key threads tying the cases together. Then the case turned from alarming to almost unthinkable. Authorities said that after Galesburg, Sheely returned to the Rock Falls area, where 4 more people were killed inside an apartment. Brock Branson, Kylina Blake, her 2-year-old son, Dion Blake, and Kenneth Wolf. Reuters reported that a jury later convicted Sheely on 4 counts of first-degree murder in those deaths. Prosecutors said the killings came after Sheely learned that his wife Holly had been involved with Branson. Imagine how investigators must have experienced that moment. A case that already involved multiple counties suddenly expanding into something even darker, with victims ranging from an elderly man to a toddler. But even then, it was not over. Authorities said Sheely drove Randall's stolen truck in Missouri, where Tom and Jill Estes, an Arkansas couple staying at a hotel in Festus after a graduation gathering, were killed. The FBI's July 1, 2008 bulletin described Sheely as suspected in 8 homicides across Illinois and Missouri, all appearing to involve blunt force trauma to the head, and warned that he should be considered armed and extremely dangerous. By then, the story had become a full public emergency. Digital billboards carried his picture. A reward of up to $25,000 was offered. News coverage spread his face across the region. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a hunt. And the ending of that hunt was almost strangely ordinary. On July 1st, 2008, Sheely was arrested outside a bar in Granite City, Illinois, after people recognized him from the news and alerted police. AP reporting said he had gone inside, ordered water, and used the bathroom before staff and a customer realized who he was. Officers arrived with FBI agents and took him into custody. After days of fear, the man at the center of the manhunt was found not in a dramatic standoff, but outside a neighborhood bar, smoking a cigarette. Sometimes that is what makes a case linger in the mind. Not that evil always looks larger than life, but that sometimes it walks into an ordinary room and waits to be noticed. The legal process that followed was long, layered, and spread across 2 states. Sheely was not convicted in one sweeping trial for all 8 deaths at once. Instead, the cases moved piece by piece. In September 2011, he was convicted in Knox County, Illinois, for the killing of Ronald Randall and later received a life sentence. In November 2012, a Whiteside County jury convicted him in the death of Russell Reed, and he was sentenced in January 2013 to life in prison, plus additional years for related charges. Then, in May 2014, a Rock Island County jury convicted him in the 4 Rock Falls killings. Reuters noted that Holly Sheely testified against him in that trial under an immunity deal, an important turning point because it gave jurors a witness from inside his closest circle. Missouri was the final chapter. Prosecutors there originally pursued the death penalty for the killings of Tom and Jill Estes. But in October 2017, Sheely pleaded guilty in Jefferson County to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed criminal action, avoiding a capital trial. The Associated Press reported that he was sentenced to life without parole for the Missouri killings, along with additional prison time on the armed criminal action counts. By that point, the courtroom story was no longer about whether he would ever be free again. It was about closing the last open file in a spree that had crossed state lines and left 8 people dead in less than a week. As of February 2026, Illinois Department of Corrections records list Nicholas T. Sheely as in custody at Western Illinois Correctional Center. In practical terms, his case is over in the way the law measures such things. Multiple murder convictions, multiple life sentences, and no realistic path back into society. But for families, over is never really the right word. The court case is ended. The prison term is permanent. Yet the ripple from 6 days in 2008 still stretches across Sterling, Galesburg, Rock Falls, Festus, and beyond. What makes the Sheely case linger is not just the number of victims. It is the speed, the way one act blurred into the next before the public even understood the shape of the threat. Imagine being in one of those towns in June 2008, hearing one report, then another, and slowly realizing they were all connected. That is the part that stays with people. Not simply that Nicholas Troy Sheely was convicted of 8 killings, but that for nearly a week, ordinary places across 2 states became stops along a trail of panic, and no one outside the investigation knew where it would end until it finally did. Number 3, Darren Dion Van. When police arrested Darren Dion Van in October 2014, they thought they were closing one homicide. Instead, they were stepping into a map of abandoned houses, missing women, and years of unanswered fear. Within hours, investigators said Van began pointing them to more bodies in Gary, Indiana. And then came the part that made the case even more unsettling. According to investigators, he hinted that the known victims might not be the full story. Imagine being a detective realizing that the suspect in front of you may not be the end of the case, but the beginning of it. Before his name became tied to 7 killings, Van looked on the surface like someone who had drifted through different versions of adult life without ever finding stability. He was a former Marine. He had spent time in Texas, where he was convicted in 2009 in a prior case and later returned to Indiana after serving his sentence. By 2014, authorities described him as a registered offender living in Gary, a city already struggling with vacancy, neglect, and the kind of empty buildings most people pass without a second glance. That setting matters because this case was not built around dramatic public scenes. It unfolded in places many people had learned not to look at too closely. The killings for which Van was ultimately convicted stretched across 2013 and 2014, and prosecutors said he targeted vulnerable women in and around Gary. The final known victim in the charged Indiana series was 19-year-old Afrika Hardy, whose body was found in a Hammond motel room on October 17, 2014. That discovery moved everything. Investigators traced evidence back to Van, arrested him the next day, and then, according to police, he began directing them to more victims. One by one, the names emerged. Aneth Jones, Tayara Beatty, Christine Williams, Tracy Martin, Sonia Billingsley, and Tanya Gatlin. Some were identified quickly, others took DNA testing, and more time. Each identification turned a hidden body into a person again, and each one made the pattern harder to ignore. What made the case especially haunting was the speed of the discovery. Police were not finding victims months apart through separate investigations. They were finding them in a rush after one arrest in abandoned buildings across Gary. Imagine the pressure in those first days. Detectives moving from one location to another. Families watching the news and wondering whether the next update would include someone they loved, and a city already used to being overlooked, suddenly becoming the center of a serial killer investigation. Hammond's police chief said at the time that Van had admitted involvement in Hardy's death, and then led officers to 6 other bodies. Officials also said he suggested his violence could go back much further. That possibility hung over the investigation almost immediately. Then the story widened beyond Indiana. In recorded interviews, later obtained and reported by NBC Chicago, Van told detectives he had killed way more victims in Illinois than in Northwest Indiana. That claim is one reason his name became tied, not just to the 7 women he admitted killing in Indiana, but also to renewed scrutiny of dozens of unsolved strangulation cases in Chicago. But this is where the facts need to stay careful. His statements helped intensify interest in those Illinois cases. Yet, public reporting has not shown Illinois murder convictions against him tied to those broader claims. In other words, there are 2 Darren Van stories running side by side. The one that ended in 7 murder convictions, and the larger shadow story of what else, if anything, can ever be firmly proved. The investigation also forced a harder question into public view. How many warning signs had been missed? For years, researchers and local officials had argued that clusters of women found dead in Gary and Chicago deserved deeper pattern analysis. After Van's arrest, those warnings no longer felt theoretical. In Chicago, public pressure eventually pushed police to review more than 50 unsolved strangulation and suffocation cases involving women found on the south and west sides. Chicago police later said available DNA from those cases did not point to one common offender, while others still argued the patterns were too strong to dismiss. That uncertainty became part of the legacy of the Van case itself. It was not only about what he admitted, it was about what his arrest forced people to re-examine. Legally, the case took years to reach its conclusion. Van was first charged in the deaths of Afrika Hardy and Aneth Jones, and prosecutors sought the death penalty while more charges were added. In 2016, 5 additional murder charges were filed, bringing the total to 7. There were battles over trial dates, motions from the defense, and an attempted challenge to Indiana's death penalty law before the case ever all reached a jury. For a while, it looked as though the courtroom fight could stretch on for much longer. Then, in May 2018, just months before trial, Van abruptly pleaded guilty to all 7 murders. The plea spared him a capital trial and removed any uncertainty about whether jurors would hear every detail. On May 25, 2018, a judge sentenced Darren Dion Van to 7 concurrent life sentences without parole. In practical terms, that means he will die in prison. The Indiana convictions are the part of this case the legal system has locked down. 7 women, 1 guilty plea, 7 life terms. The broader Illinois claims remain something else. Disturbing, influential, and still unresolved in the public record I could verify. So his current status is clear. but the full boundary of his violence may never be. What lingers about Darren Dion Van is not only the number 7, it is the image of how the case opened. One motel room, one arrest, then a chain of abandoned properties that kept giving up answers nobody wanted. Imagine how different this story feels from the outside. At first, it looks like a single crime scene, then a second, then a third. And suddenly the real horror is not just what was found, but how long so many women had been left without answers. That is why the case still resonates. Because for all the certainty of the convictions, it leaves behind one final, uncomfortable question. How many warnings does a city have to give before someone finally realizes a pattern is already underway? Number 4. Andrew Urdiales. For years, Andrew Urdiales carried one of the most unsettling kinds of secrets a killer can carry: distance. Different counties, different states, different decades. If you only looked at one case at a time, the pattern was easy to miss. But once investigators finally laid the timeline side by side, the picture became chilling. Prosecutors said Urdiales, a former Marine from Chicago, was responsible for 8 killings across Southern California and Illinois, and by the time the courts were done with him, he had been convicted of all 8. Before his name became synonymous with serial murder, Urdiales looked, on paper, like someone living a structured life. He moved to Southern California as a 19-year-old Marine and served at military installations in the region during the 1980s and early 1990s. That is part of what makes the case so disturbing. Imagine meeting someone with that background, someone who understood routine, discipline, and how to present himself as controlled. Prosecutors later argued that beneath that outward normalcy was a man who could switch from calm to lethal with almost no warning. A Cook County prosecutor described him years later as unusually calculating, someone who seemed to learn from each crime and leave very little behind. The California killings began in 1986. Authorities said 23-year-old Robin Brandley was attacked after a concert at Saddleback College in Mission Viejo. Then came Julie McGee in 1988, Mary Ann Wells later that same year, and Tammy Irwin in 1989. Prosecutors said these killings happened while Urdiales was stationed in Southern California, and that 3 of the women were linked by the same firearm. Then, after a gap of several years, prosecutors said he returned to Palm Springs in 1995 and killed Denise Maney. Imagine how frustrating that must have been for detectives at the time. 5 women across multiple counties years apart, with no easy public thread pulling them together. And yet, one of the most important moments in the entire case was not a killing, but a survival. In September 1992, 19-year-old Jennifer Asbenson accepted a ride from a man she later said looked harmless. That man, prosecutors said, was Urdiales. She survived the attack and became the only known person to escape it. Her account mattered not only because it revealed his methods, but because it showed how quickly an ordinary moment could turn into something terrifying. Imagine missing a bus, feeling stranded, and stepping into a stranger's car because it seemed like the simplest decision in the world. Years later, Asbenson's testimony helped jurors understand the human reality behind the case, not just the files and forensic reports. Then the geography changed. In 1996, after leaving the Marines and returning to Illinois, Urdiales was linked to the killings of 3 women there: Lori Uilaki, Cassandra Coram, and Lynn Huber. According to authorities, the Illinois crimes happened over a span of just a few months. This is where the story tightens. A person who had slipped through unsolved cases in California suddenly appeared in a fresh series much closer together in time. In late 1996, police stopped Urdiales in Indiana and found a gun in his truck. That stop did not look like the end of a serial case at first, but ballistics testing later matched the weapon to the Illinois murders, and in 1997, he was arrested. Prosecutors said that once he was in custody, the hidden California side of the story began to surface too. The investigation turned on something investigators rarely get in cases like this: a confession, followed by physical support for parts of it. Illinois authorities built their first prosecutions around the killings of Lori Uilaki and Lynn Huber, and in 2002, Urdiales was convicted and sentenced to death. Then came a twist that had nothing to do with innocence and everything to do with politics and law. In January 2003, Illinois Governor George Ryan commuted all death sentences in the state. including Urdiales's. But that was not the end. Prosecutors still had Cassandra Quorum's case, and in 2004, Urdiales was convicted there as well and again sentenced to death. Imagine being a victim's family and hearing death sentence twice, only to know the story still was not truly settled. It shifted again in 2011 when Illinois abolished the death penalty and Governor Pat Quinn commuted the remaining death sentences to life without parole. Within hours, California officials renewed their effort to bring Urdiales west to face the 5 long unsolved murders there. He was extradited to California in October 2011, and Orange County prosecutors consolidated the 5-county spanning case for trial. That detail matters because it shows how long this prosecution took to assemble. These were not fresh crimes with immediate arrests. They were old wounds, reopened one by one until the state believed it finally had the full map. The California trial finally reached a verdict in May 2018. A jury convicted Urdiales of 5 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Robin Brandley, Julie McGee, Mary Ann Wells, Tammy Irwin, and Denise Maney. In June, that same jury recommended death. And on October 5, 2018, an Orange County judge formally sentenced him to death for those murders. By that point, the legal record was stark. 3 murder convictions in Illinois, 5 more in California, 8 women in total. The defense had little room left to argue about identity. The courtroom fight had long since shifted from who did it to how the law would punish it. But even then, the ending was not the one many expected. Urdiales never spent years awaiting execution in California. Less than a month after his sentencing, he was found unresponsive at San Quentin. AP reported that prison officials discovered him during a security check, and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation lists his death as a suicide on November 3, 2018. So after decades of investigations, multiple trials, 2 states, and repeated death sentences, the final chapter arrived in silence inside a prison cell. What makes Andrew Urdiales linger in the mind is not only the number of victims, it is the shape of the story. California first, then Illinois, then back to California. A Marine, then a prisoner. A man who looked compartmentalized until investigators proved the compartments were all connected. Imagine how different the case must have felt for the families before that connection was made, each one thinking their loss belonged to a separate nightmare. In the end, that may be the most haunting part. Not just that Andrew Urdiales was convicted of 8 killings, but that for years, the full scope of who he was stayed hidden in plain sight. Number 5. Bruce Lindahl. Some killers are caught in court. Others are caught by time. Bruce Lindahl belongs to the second category. And that may be what makes his story so unsettling. He died in 1981, long before DNA testing could map out the damage investigators now believe he caused across Chicago's western suburbs. For decades, he was more rumor than record, a name floating around old police files, survivor accounts, and unsolved deaths. Then modern forensic work began pulling those separate threads together. By 2020 and again in 2024, prosecutors in Illinois said DNA had linked Lindahl to 2 cold case killings, adding hard proof to what investigators had suspected for years. Before that, Lindahl did not look like the kind of figure people would imagine at the center of a long-hidden serial case. He grew up in the Chicago suburbs, graduated from Downers Grove North High School, studied electromechanics, and worked as an electrician. People around him often described him as social and outwardly normal. That contrast matters. Imagine meeting someone who seems local, familiar, even dependable, and then years later, learning investigators believe he moved through the late 1970s and early 1980s, leaving a trail of missing women, assaults, and killings behind him. Authorities have said he may be responsible for as many as 12 murders and 9 attacks in the west suburbs, though only some of those links have been publicly confirmed through forensic evidence. The first case now firmly tied to Lindahl is the 1976 killing of Pamela Moore. Pamela was 16, a Downers Grove South student who left to get a soft drink and never came back. The next day, her body was found along a road in Lisle. At the time, the case had no clear answer. Then, more than 4 decades later, investigators used new forensic methods, including exhumed DNA from Lindahl's remains, to to identify him as the person responsible. Think about what that means for a cold case. Not just that a mystery is solved, but that a face finally replaces the word unknown after 44 years. In January 2020, DuPage County authorities announced that breakthrough publicly. But Pamela Moorer's case was not the end of the story. If anything, it opened the door to the larger one. Investigators said that once Lindahl was identified in Moorer's killing, they began revisiting other files that had long sat in the background. One of the most significant was the 1979 death of Kathy Halle, a 19-year-old from North Aurora. According to investigators, Halle left her apartment on March 29, 1979, planning to pick up her sister at a shopping center, but never arrived. Her body was found weeks later in the Fox River. For decades, the case stayed unsolved. Then in October 2024, authorities announced that DNA found on Hawley's clothing matched Bruce Lindahl. Kane County State's attorney said that if he had still been alive, they would have authorized first-degree murder charges and taken the case to trial. What makes Lindahl's story especially chilling is that it was not built only from bodies and lab reports. It was also built from women who survived encounters with him and spent years feeling as though they were speaking into the dark. ABC7 reported in 2020 on Annette Lazar, who said Lindahl attacked her in 1979 and that she went to police immediately, but felt she was not taken seriously. Her account added something cold case summaries often miss: the sense that danger can exist in plain sight, and that even when someone does everything right by reporting it, the system may still fail to stop what comes next. Imagine carrying that for decades, knowing you escaped while wondering who did not. Then there is the Deborah Coliander case, which may be the clearest example of how close Lindahl came to facing justice while he was still alive. In 1980, authorities said he abducted and assaulted Coliander, who escaped and contacted police from a neighbor's house. Lindahl was charged, but he posted bail and was released. Then, days before she was supposed to testify, Coliander disappeared. The charges were dropped because the key witness was gone. In 1982, months after Lindahl's own death, Coliander's body was found in a shallow grave, and authorities later said all the evidence pointed to Lindahl being responsible for her killing as well, even if the exact mechanics could no longer be tested in court. That sequence is one of the most haunting in the whole case. Imagine being one court date away from accountability, only for the witness to vanish and the prosecution to collapse. And then came the abrupt ending that froze everything in place. On April 4, 1981, Lindahl was found dead in a Naperville apartment alongside 18-year-old Charles Huber. Authorities said Lindahl had fatally stabbed Huber, but during the attack, accidentally severed a major artery in his own leg and bled to death. That single night ended whatever future crimes he might have committed, but it also cut off the normal legal process. There would be no murder trial for Pamela Moorer, no trial for Kathy Hawley, and no complete courtroom reckoning for the wider pattern investigators now believe stretched across years. Instead, detectives were left with a dead suspect, scattered case files, and a series of families who still had no formal answers. That is why the legal chapter of Bruce Lindahl's story feels so strange compared with most serial cases. There was a prosecution against him while he was alive in the Coliander case, but it collapsed after her disappearance. The later cases moved in reverse: detectives first, science second, public identification last. In 2020, officials said DNA established that Lindahl killed Pamela Moorer. In 2024, officials said DNA tied him to Kathy Hawley and that they would have charged him with first-degree murder if he were still alive. So the law reached a conclusion of sorts, but only after the suspect had been dead for decades. His current status is simple on paper. Bruce Lindahl has been dead since April 1981. There is no prison sentence, no parole question, no appeal, and no final courtroom scene where families watched a verdict come in. What exists instead is a growing forensic record, one that has turned old suspicions into named accusations, and, in 2 cases, into publicly declared resolutions. Authorities still believe he may be tied to additional killings, but those remain in the category of suspicion rather than the kind of proof now seen in the Moorer and Hawley cases. What lingers about Bruce Lindahl is the idea that he almost escaped history itself, not just the police, not just the courts, history. Imagine how easily this could have stayed buried if old evidence had degraded a little more. if his remains had never been exhumed, if no one had reopened the files. For years, he was a dead man connected mostly by whispers. Now he stands as something colder and clearer, a suspected suburban serial killer whose story was assembled not in one dramatic arrest, but piece by piece, decade by decade, until science finally did what time had failed to do. Number 6. Jorge Avila Torres. For years, the most disturbing part of the Jorge Avila Torres case was not just what happened in Illinois or what happened later in Virginia. It was the gap between them. On Mother's Day, 2005, 2 little girls vanished in Zion, Illinois. 5 years later, investigators would say the person responsible had never really disappeared at all. He had simply moved on, joined the Marines, and kept living until another violent case finally pulled everything back into the light. Imagine realizing that one of the most painful unsolved cases in a quiet suburb had been sitting in the shadow of an entirely different murder hundreds of miles away. Avila Torres was from Zion. Court records later said that when Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias were killed on May 8, 2005, he was only 16 years old and lived in the same hometown. Laura was 8, Crystal was 9. They went out on their bikes and did not come home. Families searched through the night, and the next morning, Laura's father and grandfather found the girls in a wooded area of Beulah Park Forest Preserve. One witness had seen the girls talking to someone who looked like Avila Torres, but at that stage, the case did not move toward him. Instead, it moved in a different direction almost immediately. That direction was Laura's father, Jerry Hobbs. Suspicion fell on him fast. After a long interrogation, he confessed, then later said the confession was false. He spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial, while the actual case kept slipping forward in silence. Imagine being a family already shattered by loss, then watching the investigation harden around the wrong person. And imagine what that meant for the real killer, if prosecutors had the wrong target from the start. That is what makes this case so hard to shake. It is not just a story of violence, it is also a story of time lost, and of how one mistake can echo for years. While the Zion case stalled, Avila Torres built a new life in uniform. By 2009, he was a Marine corporal living at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall in Arlington, Virginia. That summer, 20-year-old Navy Petty Officer Amanda Jean Snell was killed in her barracks room. Federal prosecutors later said Avila Torres lived on the same deck, 8 doors away. According to the Justice Department, he later admitted to a fellow prisoner that he entered her room while she slept, restrained her, and concealed her body in a wall locker, where she was discovered after she failed to report. 4. Duty. It was a shocking crime on a military base, and at the time, it looked like its own mystery. But even that was not the event that finally unraveled it. In February 2010, police in Arlington arrested Avila Torres after a series of violent attacks on women. One woman survived after being abducted and left for dead, and investigators later said those crimes led them to him. In December 2010, an Arlington County court entered judgment against him, imposing 5 life sentences plus 168 years for those attacks. That should already have marked him as one of the most dangerous offenders in the region. But behind the scenes, something even larger was about to happen. DNA collected in Virginia was entered into the national system, and that is when the old Illinois file suddenly came alive again. The breakthrough was as devastating as it was clarifying. DNA from Laura Hobbs's body excluded Jerry Hobbs and instead matched Avila Torres. Illinois prosecutors filed murder charges against him in 2012. By then, the shape of the case had changed completely. The suspect was no longer a grieving father crushed by an interrogation room. It was a man already convicted in Virginia, already tied to brutal attacks there, and already facing prosecution in the killing of Amanda Snell. Imagine being one of the investigators reopening that Zion case and realizing the answer had not merely been missed. It had lived long enough to create more victims. The legal process moved on 2 tracks. In the federal Virginia case, a jury sentenced Avila Torres to death in April 2014 for the premeditated killing of Amanda Snell. The Justice Department said he was 25 at the time of that sentence. Meanwhile, in Illinois, defense attorneys fought the DNA evidence and challenged whether it was strong enough to be used at trial. For a while, it looked like the Zion case might stretch on even longer. But in September 2018, Avila Torres pleaded guilty in Lake County to killing Laura Hobbs and Crystal. Tobias. Under that plea deal, he received a 100-year prison sentence. That plea closed one of the darkest chapters in Lake County history, but it also sharpened the tragedy around it. Judge Daniel Shanes called him a serial killer at sentencing and told him he had earned every day of his sentence. Prosecutors said the same DNA that identified the real killer also exonerated Jerry Hobbs, who had spent 5 years in jail after what he said was a false confession. So, the courtroom ending came with two truths sitting side by side: a guilty plea from the man who actually did it, and a reminder that an innocent man had lost years of his life while the real offender went on to harm others. For a time, Avila Torres sat in that rare category of inmates serving multiple life terms, a 100-year state sentence and a federal death sentence. Then the final legal twist arrived years later. On December 23, 2024, President Joe Biden commuted the sentences of 37 federal death row prisoners, and Avila Torres was one of them. Local reporting in Arlington said he was taken off federal death row and would continue serving life without parole. That means the death sentence for Amanda Snell's killing is no longer active, but the practical outcome remains the same. He will spend the rest of his life in custody with no path back into society. What lingers about Jorge Avila Torres is not only the number of victims or the fact that his crimes cross states, it is the sequence. First the girls in Zion, then the wrong man jailed, then the Marine barracks in Virginia, then the attacks that finally exposed him. Imagine hearing this story in order, one piece at a time, and realizing how differently it could have ended if one DNA match had never happened. In the end, that may be the most haunting part of all. Not just that Jorge Avila Torres was convicted of killing across 2 states, but that for years, the truth was already there, waiting for science and timing to catch up to it. Number 7. Timothy Krejcir. Sometimes a serial case does not begin with a body. It begins with a database hit. In 2007, investigators in southern Illinois retested old evidence from the 1982 killing of 23-year-old Southern Illinois University student Deborah Shepard. The DNA came back to a man who was already in prison, Timothy Krejcir. Imagine that moment from the detective's side. One old item of evidence sitting quietly for decades suddenly points not to a dead suspect or a dead end, but to a living inmate with a history of violent crimes against women. And once that door opened, it did not stop with one case. It opened into a trail that stretched across multiple states and years of forgotten fear. Before his name was tied to 9 killings, Krejcir had already spent much of his adult life in and out of prison. Associated Press reporting in 2007 said he first entered the Illinois prison system in 1963 and had spent most of the years afterward behind bars, except for a brief period of freedom in the late 1970s and early 1980s. During that window, he landed in southern Illinois, attended Southern Illinois University Carbondale, and was known in the region as an ambulance driver and EMT. That is part of what makes the story so unsettling. Imagine the contrast: a man studying criminal justice, moving through ordinary routines, even working in emergency response, while authorities would later say he was committing some of the worst crimes in the region. The murder that finally broke the pattern open was Deborah Shepard's. She was found dead in her Carbondale apartment in April 1982, just weeks before graduation. For 25 years, the case went unsolved. Then, newer DNA testing on a shirt recovered from the scene identified Krejcir, who was then an inmate at Big Muddy Correctional Center in Illinois. He confessed in 2007, but the Shepard case was only the first domino. Authorities quickly realized the same man might be tied to other cold cases in Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Imagine being one of the families hearing that news. Relief, maybe, that a name had finally surfaced, but also dread, because the more investigators looked, the bigger the map became. That is what gives the Krejcir case its slow burn horror. It was not one town discovering its own monster. It was several states realizing almost at once that their unsolved files might belong to the same man. AP reported in December 2007 that investigators in several states began re-examining late 1970s and early 1980s killings after Krejcir pleaded guilty in Illinois, and authorities announced he had admitted to additional murders. Police in Reading, Pennsylvania, Marion, Illinois, and Paducah, Kentucky, all took another look at old cases, while Missouri investigators were already building the largest part of the prosecution. One DNA match had become a confession cascade. One cold case had become a regional reckoning. The legal process moved fast once the wall finally cracked. On December 10, 2007, Krejcir pleaded guilty in Jackson County, Illinois, to killing Deborah Shepard and was sentenced to 40 years. Then, just over a month later, on January 18, 2008, he pleaded guilty in Williamson County, Illinois, to the 1978 killing of 51-year-old Virginia Lee Wetty of Marion. A judge ordered another 40-year sentence, consecutive to the Shepard term. In simple terms, even before the rest of the states finished their cases, Illinois had already stacked enough time to ensure he would never leave prison alive. Imagine waiting nearly 3 decades for answers, only to watch 2 old files suddenly close in 6 weeks. But Illinois was only part of the story. In Missouri, prosecutors tied Krejcir to 5 killings in the Cape Girardeau area dating from 1977 to 1982. On April 4, 2008, he pleaded guilty there to 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges tied to the attacks. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. He was sentenced to 13 consecutive life terms. That courtroom moment matters because it turned the case from a theory into a structure the law could finally hold. Not suspicion, not rumor, not possibly connected. Consecutive life sentences, one after another, attached to women whose cases had sat unresolved for decades. Other states kept feeling the aftershocks. Pennsylvania authorities charged Krejcir in the 1979 killing of Myrtle Rupp after DNA linked him to that case as well. In Kentucky, he admitted his role in the death of 29-year-old Joyce Tharp, and in 2010 and 2012, he received additional penalties there tied to that case. By 2012, KFIS reported he was already serving 15 life sentences in Pontiac, Illinois, with 65 more years added on top. So, when people ask about Timothy Krejcir's current status, the practical answer is simple. Even if the paperwork runs longer, he is not getting out. The sentence structure ended that question years ago. And then there is the part of the story that lingers even after the convictions. Krejcir's name did not only solve murders, it also helped expose a wrongful conviction. The Illinois Innocence Project says Grover Thompson, who died in prison in 1996, received posthumous clemency in 2019 after Krejcir confessed to the 1981 stabbing of Ida White, a crime for which Thompson had been convicted. That was the first posthumous exoneration in Illinois. Imagine that for a second. One man's confession solving old murders, while also proving that another man had lost years of his life for something he did not do. That is why Krejcir's story stays with people, not just because he confessed to 9 killings across multiple states, including Illinois, but because the case shows how long the truth can stay buried and how cruel it is when it finally arrives too late to give everyone their life back. Number 8. Paul Runge. For years, the fear around Paul Runge was not built around one neighborhood, one victim, or one explosive night. It was built around repetition. A woman goes missing, then another. Then a house fire reveals something much darker. Then a mother and child are found together. Imagine living in the Chicago suburbs in the mid-1990s and hearing those stories one at a time, never fully sure whether they were connected, only feeling that something about them was wrong in the same exact way. By the time police publicly named Runge in 2001, they said he had confessed to killing 6 women and a 10-year-old girl in attacks between 1995 and 1997. Before that, Runge did not look like a stranger drifting in from nowhere. He was from Illinois, and by the time the killings began, he had already served time for a violent 1987 attack on a 14-year-old girl. Illinois prison records show that earlier conviction remained part of his file for aggravated kidnapping and aggravated criminal sexual assault, and police said he had been paroled in 1994 before the later killings began. That history matters, because cases like this often leave behind the same painful question. How much danger was already there, and how close did the system come to stopping it sooner? According to police, Runge's violence was not random in the sense of chaos. It was calculated in the sense of access. Cook County prosecutors said he conned his way into women's homes or tricked them into trusting him. In some cases, police said, he used help-wanted ads. In others, authorities later said he approached women under ordinary pretenses, making himself look harmless long enough to get through the door. That is one reason the case still feels so unsettling. Imagine how ordinary the first few seconds of contact must have seemed. A conversation, a question, a small favor. And then, somewhere inside that routine moment, the whole outcome changes. Police said the killings began on January 3, 1995, when Stacy Frobel disappeared near the townhouse complex where Runga lived. Her remains were later recovered in parts, scattered far from where she had last been seen. Later that year, 2 Bosnian refugee sisters from Hanover Park, Zaneta and Amila Pasambegovic, also vanished, and prosecutors later said Runga confessed to killing them as well. Then, in 1997, the pattern accelerated again. Dorota Jubak was killed in January. On February 3, 1997, Yolanda Gutierrez and her 10-year-old daughter, Jessica Muniz, were attacked inside their Chicago home. Weeks later, Kazimiera Paruch was killed too. Investigators said some victims were strangled, some were beaten, some were dismembered, and in at least one case fire was used to cover what had happened. The details were different enough to confuse the surface of the case, but similar enough to haunt it. For a while though, police still did not have the final break they needed. Runga had been back behind bars since 1997 on a parole violation, not on murder charges. Then came the turning point. DNA recovered in the Gutierrez-Muniz case linked back to him, and authorities said that when investigators confronted him with that evidence, he confessed to all 7 killings. Think about that moment from the investigator's side. Years of separate files, separate victims, separate grief, and suddenly one forensic thread pulls them together. The public learned in June 2001 that Runga had been charged in connection with the 7 killings and could face the death penalty. But this is where the legal story becomes more complicated than the public one. Authorities attributed 7 killings to Runga, and he confessed to them. Yet the murder conviction that ultimately defined his sentence came from the Cook County case involving Yolanda Gutierrez and Jessica Muniz. The Illinois Supreme Court later summarized that case as first-degree murder charges for those 2 deaths. And in February 2006, a jury convicted him. That distinction matters. In public memory, Paul Runga became known as the man behind 7 Chicago area killings. In court, the death. Sentence rested on the murders of the mother and daughter, whose case produced the strongest forensic evidence. That trial carried special weight in Illinois at the time. Prosecutors pushed for death, and the jury agreed. CBS. Chicago later reported that Runga was convicted in February 2006 and sentenced to death for the killings of Gutierrez and Muniz. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld that conviction and sentence in 2009, rejecting his appeal. Imagine the sense of finality families must have felt then. After years of waiting, there was a verdict, a death sentence, and at least the feeling that the system had reached its hardest possible answer. And then, Illinois changed the law. On March 9, 2011, Governor Pat Quinn signed the abolition of the death penalty and commuted the sentences of all 15 men, then on death row, to life without parole. Runga was one of them. That decision reshaped the remaining cases against him. In March and August 2011, prosecutors dropped several pending murder cases against him, including the Pasambegovic sisters case, and cases tied to Stacy Frobel, Dorota Jubak, and Kazimiera Paruch, saying there was no harsher penalty left to seek. For some families, that meant the state's practical outcome was settled, but the courtroom record would never fully mirror the broader story police had laid out. As of March 2026, Illinois Department of Corrections records list Paul F. Runga as in custody at Pontiac Correctional Center, serving a life sentence and marked ineligible for release. So his current status is clear. He is alive, imprisoned, and will remain there. What is less tidy is the way the case sits in memory. 7 killings were attributed to him. 7 killings were part of the confession story. But the formal murder conviction that locked him away for life centered on 2 victims. What lingers about Paul Runga is not just the number of victims, it is the method, the quietness of it. The way authorities said he entered lives by appearing useful, ordinary, or safe. Imagine how many true crime cases begin with a stranger forcing his way in. This one is harder to forget because prosecutors said trust itself was the doorway. And in the end, that may be the most chilling part of all. Not simply that Paul Runge was tied to a series of killings across the Chicago area, but that he seemed to understand how to make normal moments feel harmless right up until they were not. Number 9. Samuel Little. Some serial cases explode into the news with one dramatic arrest. Samuel Little's story worked the other way. For decades, he seemed to move through the country like a ghost, leaving behind women who were often dismissed, misclassified, or simply forgotten. Then, late in life, while already in prison, he started talking. And what he said was almost impossible to process. He claimed he had killed 93 people between 1970 and 2005. The FBI later said it believed all 93 confessions were credible, and by October 2019, it had verified 50 of them, calling him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Imagine hearing that and realizing the case was not growing by one victim at a time, but by the dozens. Before the confessions turned him into a national symbol of how long a violent predator can go undetected, Little had lived a drifting, unstable life built around motion. Public reporting and law enforcement accounts described him as a former boxer, a man who moved from state to state, picked up arrests over the years, and spent much of his life around people living on the margins. That detail matters because the women he later described targeting were often vulnerable, and their deaths were sometimes written off as overdoses, accidents, or cases unworthy of urgent attention. Imagine how different this story looks if even a handful of those early deaths had been treated from day one as part of a pattern instead of separate tragedies. For years, though, there was no public sense of a nationwide pattern, with his name attached to it. What eventually brought him down was not a sweeping serial killer task force connecting dozens of cases at once. It was DNA. In 2012, Little was arrested at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, and extradited to California. Once authorities had him, Los Angeles investigators matched his DNA to 3 unsolved killings from the late 1980s. Carol Alford in 1987, Audrey Nelson in 1989, and Guadalupe Apodaca in 1989. All 3 women had been found in South Los Angeles after being beaten and strangled. Suddenly, a man who had spent years seeming like just another violent drifter became the center of a much darker story. That trial became the first real courtroom anchor in a case that would later sprawl across the entire country. In 2014, a Los Angeles jury convicted Samuel Little of those 3 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At that point, the legal system had finally pinned him down, but only for 3 killings. Imagine being one of the families in other cold cases around the country and not knowing that the man responsible for your daughter, sister, or mother might already be locked away under a different set of names. The verdict looked like an ending. In reality, it was only the beginning of the full reckoning. The case widened after Texas Ranger James Holland and FBI analysts began interviewing Little in prison. That is when the scale changed. Little started describing victims from state after state, often in striking detail, and even drew portraits of many of the women. The FBI said in 2018 that he had confessed to 90 murders. By October 2019, that number had risen to 93. The Bureau also said his recollection of dates was not always exact, but that law enforcement believed the confessions themselves were credible. This is what makes the case so unnerving. Imagine sitting across from someone who can calmly describe faces, places, highways, bars, cars, and clothing from killings. That happened decades earlier, as if those memories had been waiting all along for someone patient enough to unlock them. That is also where Illinois enters the story. The FBI's public case map includes at least 2 Illinois confessions tied to Samuel Little. One in Granite City involving a 26-year-old black woman he said he killed sometime between 1976 and 1979 after meeting her in St. Louis, and another in East St. Louis involving a black woman he said he killed during that same general period. But here, the language has to stay precise. On the FBI's own page, both Illinois entries were still listed as unmatched confessions, rather than definitively corroborated cases. So, when people say Samuel Little was linked to at least 2 Illinois victims, that is true in the sense that he confessed to 2 Illinois killings, and the FBI publicly posted them. It is not the same as saying those Illinois cases reached the same level of courtroom proof as the 3 Los Angeles murders. That difference between confession and confirmation is a huge part of the Samuel Little story. The FBI made a point of saying many of his victims had never been properly counted in the first place. Some had been identified only as Jane Does. Some deaths had been classified in ways that did not trigger the same kind of homicide investigation. Some bodies were never found at all. In other words, the reason his number could grow so shockingly high was not only because he kept killing, it was also because the system kept missing who was missing. That is the part of this case that lingers long after the headline about 93 victims. Imagine how many separate towns, police files, and grieving families were living in the disconnected stories, only to learn that one man may have been moving through all of them. Legally, however, the final chapter remained much narrower than the full map of confessions. Samuel Little died in custody on December the 30th, 2020, at age 80, while serving his California life sentence. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation announced his death, and there was no sign of foul play reported in the immediate notice. That means there was never going to be one giant national trial for all 93 killings, or even for the dozens investigators continued trying to match after his interviews. The courtroom record stayed small compared with the scale of what authorities believe he did. 3 Los Angeles murder convictions became the legal core. The rest became an enormous national effort to identify victims in close cases after the fact. What makes Samuel Little so difficult to forget is not just the number, it is the invisibility. He did not dominate headlines for years the way some serial killers do. He did not leave behind one famous crime scene or one easily followed timeline. Instead, he slipped through cracks that were already there. Cracks in policing, in victim visibility, in public attention, and in who gets counted quickly when they disappear. Imagine how many cases might still be unsolved if he had never started confessing. That may be the most haunting part of all. Not simply that Samuel Little was called the most prolific serial killer in American history, but that his story suggests the true scale of violence can stay hidden for decades when the victims are the kind of people society too often overlooks. Number 10. Arthur Hilliard. By the time a Cook County jury found Arthur Hilliard guilty in December of 2025, the case had already carried the kind of weight that builds over years, not days. Diamond Turner was 21 when her body was found in a garbage can in a Southside alley in March 2017. Nearly 3 years passed before police said DNA evidence finally led to Hilliard's arrest, and nearly 6 more passed before the verdict arrived. Imagine what that does to a family. Not just the loss itself, but the waiting. The sense that the answer is sitting somewhere in the city, still breathing while time keeps moving. Anyway, before his name became publicly tied to Diamond Turner's death, Hilliard was not some shadowy figure no one could place. Prosecutors and local reporting described him as a Chicago man in his early 50s, a father of 5, and the manager of the apartment building, where key parts of the case would later center. Reports also described a long criminal history, though much of it involved smaller cases that never seemed to signal what prosecutors would eventually accuse him of doing. That is often what makes stories like this so unsettling. Imagine someone who is already known around the block, already part of the scenery, and then years later, the same name suddenly sits at the center of one of the city's most disturbing unsolved killings. Diamond Turner disappeared in the first days of March 2017. Her family said she had last been seen leaving Red's Lounge on South Stony Island Avenue with Hilliard. Prosecutors later added more detail, saying witnesses saw Turner later that night at a club inside the South Dorchester building Hilliard managed, where the two kept drinking and where they were said to be in a relationship at the time. Then the trail stopped. On March 3rd, sanitation workers found Turner's body in a trash bin in Grand Crossing. Authorities said she died from asphyxia and blunt force trauma. Imagine hearing that timeline as a relative. She leaves a lounge, she is seen with someone familiar, and then the next concrete moment is a city worker making a terrible discovery in an alley. What made the case linger so painfully was how much the family believed early on that they already knew where police should be looking. Diamond Turner's aunt said, relatives and activist Andrew Holmes secretly recorded Hilliard after the killing, and in that recording, he allegedly described the crime in vivid detail while blaming one of his roommates. ABC7 also reported that when journalists spoke to Hilliard in 2017, he denied killing Turner and again tried to place responsibility on someone else. So, for years, the family was left in a strange and brutal position, feeling certain the right person had been in front of everyone, but still watching the case remain open. Imagine carrying that level of frustration for month after month, then year after year, wondering how close almost solved really is to not solved at all. Then came the part of the story that made it even harder to look away. While police and the state crime lab were still working through DNA in the Turner case, Hilliard became entangled in another killing. In September 2018, Andra Carl Williams was found in a shopping cart in an alley behind a West Side building Hilliard managed. Surveillance video, prosecutors said, showed Hilliard wheeling the body into the alley. In January 2019, he pleaded guilty not to killing Williams, but to concealing the homicidal death, receiving a 300-day sentence that effectively meant about 150 days in custody, plus probation. Then, when Turner's case finally moved in 2020, prosecutors said Hilliard was also a suspect in yet another 2019 killing following an argument, though no public charge in that case was identified in the reporting I reviewed. That is the detail that changes the whole emotional shape of the story. Imagine believing one killing might have been prevented if the earlier one had been solved faster. The investigation into Diamond Turner's death eventually turned on forensic evidence. Chicago police and state lab officials publicly pointed fingers at each other over delays. But the broader picture became clear. DNA. Evidence linked Hilliard to the case. Police got the state's latest report in 2019. A warrant was issued that October, and he was arrested in January 2020 after police said they had trouble locating him because of a probation violation. He was charged with first-degree murder and ordered held without bail. Public reporting focused heavily on the prosecution's case, DNA, witness, accounts, and the long chain of suspicious behavior after Turner disappeared. The clearest defense thread in the public record was Hilliard's earlier denials and his attempt to blame someone else. In December 2025, jurors rejected that and found him guilty on all 3 counts, including murder and concealing a homicide. And this is where Arthur Hilliard's case intersects with something even bigger and more uncomfortable in Chicago. CBS. Chicago reported in 2020 that his arrest renewed police efforts to examine whether one or more serial killers might be responsible for a larger cluster of female strangulation and asphyxiation cases on the south and west sides. Turner's death had already been discussed alongside those killings because of its method and circumstances, and CBS reported that police planned to recheck DNA in other unsolved cases against Hilliard's profile. But that is where the careful line has to stay. His conviction gives Diamond Turner's family an answer. It, does not, by itself, prove the broader Chicago Strangler theory. Imagine how uneasy that leaves the city. One name finally attached to one case, while the larger pattern still hovers in the background, unresolved. Legally, the story is now much clearer than it was for years, but it is not fully finished. Hilliard is the convicted killer of Diamond Turner. He previously admitted concealing Andrew Williams' body. ABC7's December 2025 report said he was due back in court later that month for post-trial motions. And I did not find a later verified sentencing report in the sources I reviewed. So, as of the latest reliable public reporting I found, the conviction is in place, but the final sentencing stage was still not clearly documented. That matters because true crime stories often flatten everything into one dramatic ending. Real cases do not always end that neatly. Sometimes even after a guilty verdict, paperwork, hearings, and unanswered side questions still remain. What lingers about Arthur Hilliard is not just the conviction. It is the feeling of how long the truth seemed to stay within reach without fully locking into place. A family says he knew too much. A recording exists. Another body appears in another alley. Prosecutors point to a third killing. DNA takes years. And only then does the courtroom finally catch up. Imagine standing in Diamond Turner's family's place and asking the question that haunts so many cases like this. If the system had moved faster, how many later chapters would never have been written? That may be the part that lasts the longest. Not simply that Arthur Hilliard was found guilty of killing Diamond Turner, but that the case leaves behind the uneasy sense that justice arrived, just not when it was first needed most.